climate is certainly a factor, but it's one of many factors that is contributing to ticks expansion north. If we're having hotter, drier summers, that can alter the tick's behavior. If we're having warmer and shorter winters, then certainly that facilitates the tick's ability to persist further and further north. But again, there's certainly things that we do as humans, the way we use the land, the way we recreate, things like that can also influence the tick's ability to persist. Of course, the wildlife hosts that they rely on for their meals, how they move about the landscape and how they expand their ranges plays a real role. So it is kind of this multiple factor system that's really contributing. It's not just one kind of silver bullet factor that we can point to and say, this has caused ticks to expand and explode in numbers. It's really this multifactorial situation.
I had read this that ticks have to thrive in an environment that's 85% humidity or not. Can you kind of explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, so ticks really do dry out quite easily. The black-legged tick or deer tick in particular needs fairly high humidity, somewhere in the 85 to 90% or up to really survive and to thrive. So that's why we generally find them primarily in kind of forested habitats, edge locations, places where there's a lot of shade, there's a lot of vegetation. Some of our other tick species, the dog tick in particular, is a bit more hardy. It can survive in kind of open and exposed locations. It doesn't dry out quite as easily. And the Lone Star tick, which is also starting to emerge, also can kind of survive in some of those exposed locations. So, in addition to this kind of classic tick habitat that we think of as forest and edge, we do have these other species that can actually survive kind of out in the open and potentially out in the yard and around the home landscape as well.
So like a day like today, they would love, right?
Yeah, so a day like today, cloudy, overcast, kind of rainy. A lot of moisture in the air. Certainly ticks are going to be active. Now that's not to say when it is hot and dry that they're not active, but they may change their activity a bit. They may quest lower and lower in the vegetation. That way they can retain as much moisture as possible. They can focus some of their questing behavior more so in the evenings, at night. Concentrating at times when the temperature is a bit lower. So certainly it will alter their behavior.
I know we talked about this last week, but that prolonged dry spells that we saw last summer could definitely bring the numbers down because they are not questing as much. And we know the plants and the trees take so much more moisture out of the soil as well to survive. And then if they don't have a lot to really kind of their ideal environment, that could play a role too, right? Yeah,
and so what we saw last year was kind of interesting because we did have these prolonged, months-long periods where it was hot, it was dry, it was just not really conducive to tick activity and black-legged tick activity in particular. And that was right in kind of the nymphal peak. And those immature ticks are also really highly susceptible to drying out. So it's not so much that they necessarily died off, but they did change their behavior, so they were being found less so on people. And so that certainly can alter the transmission cycle and the number of reported cases of tick-borne disease here in Maine.
When you say nymphs dry out, does that mean their activity goes down, or they actually dry up and die?
So both. I mean, the dry weather can change their behavior so that they change so that they can reduce the amount of moisture that they lose. And if it stays really hot and really dry and they can't retain that moisture, then they truly will dry out and die.
And those are the ones, of course, that emerge into the adult ticks that we see.
Exactly, and that was kind of the interesting thing about last year in particular as far as what we saw here at the lab, because we certainly saw reduced nymph numbers during the midsummer when it was hot and dry. As a result, we saw kind of a reduced caseload of reported cases of Lyme disease and other tick-borne disease. But then when fall rolled around, we certainly didn't see any shortage of adult ticks. So they were finding a host somehow and somewhere. It just didn't happen to be humans, it appears.
So the numbers showed you that later on in the year?
Yeah, so those adult ticks that emerge in the fall would have been that summer's nymphs. And so we certainly didn't really see a dip there in the adult numbers.
It just goes to also show like they almost seem indestructible. How they survive.
Yeah.
And you're learning more about them all the time. Where you think this prolonged dry spell would have brought those numbers down if it didn't. They're finding other ways.
Yeah.
Almost like the bacteria, which is very pervasive as well. They're
Yeah.
pervasive, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. They're very pervasive. They're persistent pests on the landscape. They tend to find a way to survive. And that's what's made them so successful. They've been able to really rebound from, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, when their range was really limited to a small part of the country, and now they're really widespread throughout the eastern United States.